Andy Brady with Green Home Solutions. I do mold inspections. I do mold consultations. I sit down and chat with people about mold. I do presentations about mold. I remediate mold. I destroy mold. I take care of indoor air quality, which is what our company does, is overall indoor air quality, dust, dander, pollen, mold, mildew, which mold and mildew are the same thing. You know, if we can take nothing else away today, mold and mildew are identical. You know, dead skin cells, dust mite waste, insect waste, bacteria. That's the kind of stuff that we take out of your home. When people ask you, do you have a healthy home? A lot of people respond and they say, yeah, my kids are healthy, my husband's healthy, we're good. When we ask, do you have a healthy home, we mean, are you living in a nasty indoor air quality home? You might have a beautiful home, it was built 3 years ago and it's in perfect condition, and the actual health of the home might not be good. So that's where my experience comes from, that's where my background comes from. And then after doing mold remediation for quite some time, we came across people who were patients at doctor's offices. And I'll be honest, the first time I got a phone call and they said, you know, I had my blood work done and they said, you have mold in your home, I was like, what are you even talking about? You know, I'll be honest, I was just as ignorant as so many other people out there. And I said, fine, we'll come out and inspect, and went out there and it's like, oh man, there's a terrible mold problem here. And then I heard that again from another patient later, and we started putting pieces together and saying, yeah, you know, there is a correlation here. When we're getting, you know, these doctor's offices, when we have allergy clinics that are sending people to us saying that you have mold toxicity in your blood, you have elevated toxins in your blood, you know, we started taking it seriously. Like, when we go out to this home, we have to find it because it's going to be here. And we started finding more and more that pretty much when we go to a home that somebody has mold toxicity, we're finding the mold somewhere. And that kind of became our job, that when we get those leads, that's specifically what we look for. And so we started branching out and learning more about just destruction of mold, but everything else to go with it. Number one question that everyone always asks, and I'm sure you guys have heard this question before, is mold bad? And I've got a banana on the screen. Anyone know why?
I know why.
Well, you've heard this before.
I did, because Kathy went to your presentation last time.
So one of the reasons we eat bananas is because it's got potassium in it, which on the periodic table is K, right? Which is radioactive. So when you eat a banana, you're exposed to radiation. When you carry a banana through the store, you're exposed to radiation. If you sleep next to somebody who ate a banana that day, you're technically exposed to radiation. But it's not the same as being in Chernobyl, right? It's all about what kind of radiation and what kind of levels. And mold's the same way. What kind of mold, what kind of levels? Is it a very small amount of a mold that's, you know, toxinogenic potential, or is it an extremely large amount of the same mold, or an extremely large amount of one that's considered more of a nuisance mold? So everything's based on levels, you know, and the most important thing is, I have a dishwasher at home. It's got a normal setting. None of us have a normal setting. So what's normal for one person is not normal for another. So there are all these organizations out there, there's all these you know, different testing facilities out there that have tried to say this is a normal level of mold. This is an acceptable level of mold. Well, for me, an acceptable level of Bs is any level. I don't have problems with them. For my dad, 1B could be a bad problem, and he has to carry around an EpiPen. So everyone is going to be different whenever it comes to mold and any other type of toxins inside of the house. So while it's important to know the levels, it's important to know what levels work for you, what levels are healthy for you. Yet there are levels that we would say, regardless of your health, regardless of this, that, and the other, these levels are too high. These levels are too much. Just like radiation. There is a point where it doesn't matter who you are, your DNA starts to break down around radiation. Mold doesn't break down your DNA, but there is a point that is too much for anyone to be around. That is just not an acceptable scenario for you to have in your life. I have a bunch of these little slides in here because mold can get to be boring talk. So these are my paying attention slides. These are going to be just utter nasty pictures, just things you don't want to see. And these are the things we see on a day-to-day basis. Somebody calls us in and they say, I have a little bit of a mold problem. And we get in here and we find the paneling buckled under and just covered in mold. And I don't know what kind of mold that was. I don't have the document in front of me, but it doesn't really matter. That's way too much. Shouldn't have that much mold in your house. What's the concern with having mold in your house? Well, a percentage of the population is allergic to mold, the same way that I'm allergic to pollen. They walk into a moldy house and they have hay fever style reactions. In fact, I tried to hire one of my best friends to be a salesperson for me, to come in and inspect homes. Came to the very first job site with me. I was like, hey, I kind of know a little bit about this house. It's going to be moldy. Wait and see, And I was kind of going for the gross out factor on this house. And we walked in. By the time we got 25 steps in, I turned back to say something to him, and his eyes are watering. His eyes are bright red. His nose is running. And he's like, I got to get out of here. So he wasn't having a long-term effect. He was having an actual allergy to it. And I've heard numbers between 12 and 22% of the population has that style allergy to mold. So that's 1 in 5 of the population has an immediate negative reaction to mold. Now, he went out to the van. I finished my inspection. By the time I came back out, he was fine. So for some people, they might be fine when they leave the environment. For me, for example, when I get away from the pollen, I'm fine. When I'm walking outside and you can see the pollen blown from the trees, that's when I become an utter wreck. That's when I grab my mold mask and put it on while I'm mowing, and my neighbors are all like, seriously, who is this guy? Asthma, it's been pretty well documented and proven through testing, through what's called the ERMI testing, which is a historical mold test, that there is a direct correlation to people who have been around mold all their life, been around elevated levels, and been around certain types of toxinogenic potential molds. And there's a direct link to show that those people have developed asthma. And so they've done extensive research to try to find that link, and they have found that link. And they have found that being around excessive levels of mold can cause you to be more likely to develop asthma. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to or not. And they can test your blood for it. They can test your blood and send it off to the laboratory, and they can find the same toxins in your blood that are linked back to specific types of mold. And they can say that the toxins in your blood are the same style toxins, the same type of toxins that we would expect to see from somebody who's been in a moldy environment. And that's when we start to get the doctor referrals for our business, is when somebody's gotten their blood work done and they say, oh my gosh, your toxin levels, you got mycotoxins, endotoxins, you got all these things in your blood at, exorbitant levels. Please have your home inspected. And whether it's us or another, inspection company, we go out and we take a look, and hopefully we find the problem, because they've got the toxicity in their blood. So we need to try to find where they're being exposed to it. And then one of the final concerns, this is a hotly debated topic. I have seen with my own eyes very good doctors that I trust both knockdown shout-out matches over whether this is true or not. People can be exposed to 1 or 2 bee stings and be fine. And we've all heard stories about somebody who was stung by a couple hundred of them. They wandered into a nest and they developed an allergy. Their body literally starts rejecting the toxin that comes from bee stings. And so there's a school of thought that there is a certain point when you have been exposed to so much mold that your body kind of stops processing it. I tend to believe that side. We all know what happens to an alcoholic that drinks too much. Their body starts shutting down. It stops processing the alcohol. Even though your body can process alcohol, it gets to the point where it stops processing it. So I tend to believe that side. But again, I'm not a doctor, so confirm that with your own physician of choice and find out if I'm telling the truth or if I'm debunked. But I do believe in that, and from what I've seen, it seems to be, in firsthand experience, discussing with patients and inspecting their houses, it seems to be very logical and it seems to make sense.
Andy, I think, didn't Dr. Castor speak about that? I think Dr. Castor and Dr. Hollis both spoke to what you're...
Yep, to my knowledge, they both agree on that front. And they might even, honestly, they've had a big influence on me whenever it comes to the medical side. So, you guys have much smarter people to talk about the medical side than me. Is it the bad mold? I get asked that all the time. And in fact, I did do a TV interview recently, and it wasn't one of the questions that they were supposed to ask, and they fell right into it and they asked it at the end, and I loved it because I give the same answer all the time. That's like asking, is it a good grizzly bear or a bad grizzly bear? If it's living in Yellowstone, sure, it's a good grizzly bear. But if it's living in your living room and it's propagating, it's having kids and it's expanding its family, it's a bad grizzly bear. It's not what you want to have in your home, right? The same could be said about colonies of bees. Honeybees are fantastic, But if they're nesting in your kitchen cabinets, you probably don't want them in your house. So mold should not be growing inside of your home. Yes, you should have mold in your home. Typical indoor air quality that we find around here per cubic meter is going to have between 400 and 1,000 spores per cubic meter at all times around us right now. That should be the environment because it's going to mimic the outdoor environment pretty closely. The moment that you actually have it growing in your home, it's not a good thing. And I don't know if you guys have heard this said, but I know we hear it said a lot is people say, oh, well, I go hiking through the woods all the time. Well, it's true, but you don't set up your tent and bring in rotting, decaying, wood into your tent and sleep in that environment for 8 hours and then spend all that time. And then especially if we test your home and we find that your home has 10 times or 20 times more mold in it than it does in the woods, that kind of discredits that argument real quick because I spend a lot of time outside. Okay, well, if your indoor air is 5 times worse than your outdoor air, which is what the EPA claims, 5 times worse. If it's 5 times worse, then who cares how much you hike in the woods? Because when you come home and you sleep and you're spending 20 hours a day in your house, 16 to 20 hours a day in your house, you're being exposed to higher levels. So any mold growing in your home is bad. You don't want it. If it's growing in your home, you make an effort to eliminate it, to stop it from growing, to stop it from becoming worse, because it's just going to grow exponentially. The first dandelion you see in your yard, you don't freak out. And then a week later, you've got 500, and it's kind of a problem. And it starts, getting out of control. Another fun slide, some examples. This is just a standard vent off of a ceiling of a house completely covered in mold. Your ductwork in your home is 100% humidity when you have your air conditioning running. If it's not, then your air conditioning is not running effectively. So the air conditioning unit pulls in your 70-degree air and it drops it by about 18 degrees on average. And what that does is it compresses the air down. It makes it much smaller. It means the water content goes up. It means your humidity of that air skyrockets. It touches the coils, it reaches dew point, and it starts to drain the moisture away. So yes, an air conditioner dehumidifies your home. And that's where a lot of confusion comes in. I tell people that your ductwork's full of humidity, and they say, no. Whenever I turn on my air conditioning, it dehumidifies my home. That's true. It takes it from 70 degrees, drops it 18 degrees, it squishes out some, not a very scientific term, squishes out some of the extra water that can't be held in that small of an area, of air, and then it blows through your ductwork after it pulls out as much moisture as it can. And so when we put a hygrometer right on top of your vent, it's almost at 100% humidity. So if that vent is on this side of the room 70 degrees and on the other side 18 degrees less, are you hitting dew point the same way that you did inside of your air conditioning unit? A lot of times, yes, which is why a lot of times you'll see air conditioning vents literally dripping moisture. It happens really bad at the beach where the humidity is 90 to 100% all the time. You might be walking in, the air conditioning is full blast, and you look up and all of the metal grills are just soaking wet. And you'll have a lot of people say, oh, that's just dirt. Well, mold doesn't really like to grow on metal. So dirt forms first. Dirt is made up mostly of dead skin cells, which is a perfect food source for mold to grow on. So then you have mold start to land on it because mold's everywhere. It's blowing through your HVAC unit. It's doing it all the time because mold is everywhere. It starts landing on the skin cells, starts landing on the dust, dander, pollen. It starts landing and it starts condensating and getting wet. And then it just starts growing. And then it gets worse and worse and worse. And you end up with a situation like this. This is the same style situation, but not involving air conditioning directly. This is a basement that is non-conditioned. So the basement is very humid. There's no dehumidifier down there. Maybe it's 70, 80, 90% humidity. Literally 70, 80, 90%. And the upstairs is air conditioned to a nice 70 degrees. Well, when you take a can of soda outside, where does the water form? Not inside of the soda where it's cold, forms on the outside where it's warm. Forms on the downstairs, on the underside. You can see here's like a little light fixture. I guess I could have centered that a little bit better. But it's literally condensating on the joists, on the underside of the floor, and mold is just growing because it's being given moisture source. There's no sink above there that's leaking. There's no dishwasher up there that's leaking. It's all based on not controlling the humidity. So where and how does mold grow? Mold needs 3 things to grow. It needs the right temperature, which unfortunately is any temperature that we exist in. We've all opened up our fridge. It's 35 degrees. We open up the thing of vegetables. It's been sealed up since the moment we cooked it, and it's covered in mold, right? So it can live in 35 degrees. It can live in the desert. An animal dies in the desert, it still gets covered in mold, it still gets covered in bacteria, it still breaks down. So it can live in 115 degrees. I mean, we've got to cook our food to what, 160 before they say it's safe most of the time. So you're not going to get your indoor air quality to be in a temperature that you can live and outlive the mold, okay? You can't put your couch outside when it's 0 degrees outside and hope to kill the mold. A lot of people do it. We talk to people all the time and do that. They're like, oh, it was 0 degrees and it was 0% humidity, so I put all my furniture outside to kill all the mold. No, it'll be just fine. You know, you might kill some of it, but in Siberia, it gets to negative 67 degrees in the winter, and then come in the spring when it's still ridiculously cold, the mold starts growing again because it will kill the upper layer, but it really can't get a chance to get all the way through and kill everything. So it needs the right temperature, and we can't control that. It needs something to grow on. Well, as I just showed you, it'll grow on metal. And that's the worst place for it to grow. It doesn't like to grow on metal. It doesn't like to grow anywhere where it can't form a root system. So it doesn't like to grow on metal, plastic, glass, ceramic, tile, things like that. But it does. We see it all the time. We see it in our bathtub. When we go to clean the plastic, mold will grow just about anywhere. Now it's easier to clean off of things where there's no root system. And again, if I can go back to the dandelion example, if I try to pull a dandelion out of my grass, I'm going to have to really work hard to get the roots out. But if I go to my paved driveway where there's a dandelion and I pull it up, the root system just comes right up. Because the root system started to grow in whatever little bit of dirt was there, but it couldn't actually form a root system. And the same thing's going to happen with a lot of places where mold's going to grow. The exception to that is going to be wood. When it's a tree, it's very resistant to mold. The closer you take that tree to paper, the easier it is for mold to grow. So you take the tree and you cut it down and you turn it into a table. It's easier to grow mold than it was when it was a tree. Still pretty difficult. Then you have that chipped up and turned into some cheap plywood, OSB board. It's even easier. What's happening in this process is you're breaking down the cellular bonds in the wood every single time that you process it. And when you break down those cellular bonds, you make it easier for mold to grow. Then the next step would be maybe they turn it into sawdust and they packed it together, and that's a different type of plywood made out of sawdust or fiberboard. Maybe it's literally cardboard and sawdust crammed together into fiberboard. That's going to be even easier. And then maybe you turn it into pulp, which completely destroys the cellular structure. You bleach it, you put chemicals on it, you completely destroy everything, and you turn it into paper. That's why old books smell moldy, because they are. Paper is very easy to become moldy. So what's the third thing that it needs? We've already established you can't control the temperature. You're not going to get rid of everything in your house and completely ceramic tile every single thing that you own, and even still mold could still grow in it. So the third thing is moisture. It needs moisture. And a lot of people think, oh, well, my basement doesn't flood. My toilet doesn't overflow. I don't have any leaks in my house. But as we saw with this picture, humidity can do that. Condensation can do that. So the magic number for humidity is 58%. Some of your lighter weight molds, like your penicilliums and your aspergilluses, which we call penasp because we're too lazy to say the whole thing or type the whole thing. So, you know, your penasp, it can grow, and many other types of mold can grow based on humidity alone. And that magic number is 58%, which is actually pretty low. It's not that high of a humidity number. So you get to 58, 59, 60%. The mold spores that are naturally floating around in your air land on the wood, and they can actually start absorbing the moisture from the air and start growing based on that. That's why foreclosures, full of mold. They turned off the electricity, there's no air conditioning, the temperature goes up, the temperature goes down, the humidity goes up and down, it will reach dew point, the humidity will skyrocket, and the walls will be covered in mold. Just covered, absolutely covered. And that's based on humidity. So you can try to control your humidity. Anything subterranean, put in a dehumidifier. If it's underground at all, you need a dehumidifier. I don't care if the house was built a week ago, I don't care if the house was built 120 years ago. If it's underground, you're going to want a dehumidifier because the ground is naturally going to be more moist. And that moisture is going to slowly evaporate into the air, and you're going to find that all basements are humid, all of them. And let's say somehow you have a basement that is miraculously sealed better than any other basement, and you put a dehumidifier in there and you set it to 50%, then it won't run very often. But it'll still run when it needs to. When it rains for 10 days straight and the humidity happens to raise up, that's when it will turn on, and it'll do everything it can to get it back below 50%. And then when it's below 50%, it turns off. And maybe it stays off for 6 months and then cuts back on. Never unplug your dehumidifier, even during the winter. If it sleets for 10 days straight, it's 100% humidity outside. It's 100% humidity inside of your house a lot of times. You unplug the dehumidifier because winters are dry. I should humidify. No, leave that dehumidifier plugged in. If it doesn't need to cut on, it won't cut on. And if it does need to, it will. It's got that handy little hygrometer on there that just automates the service. And make sure you spend the extra $20 or $30 to get the one that has a drain hose so that you never have to touch it. You don't have to empty the buckets, because if you have to empty the buckets, you're not going to do it. Or if you do it, you're not going to do it often enough. So you'll buy a dehumidifier that says it can do 95 pints a day, but realistically it's getting 20 because you're not dumping it often enough. So spend the extra little bit of money, and always oversize your dehumidifiers. And I don't mean drastically. You know, if the dehumidifier says it'll do 500 square foot and your house is 500 square foot, maybe go one size up. Don't go to the one that says it'll do 3,600 square foot. You're just wasting money, and believe it or not, it won't be as effective because it'll cut on, it'll drop the humidity around it really quick, it'll cut off, and then an hour later, the humidity's kind of mingled back together, and it'll cut back on and cut back off and cut back on and cut back off. Same problem happens a lot of times we see in brand new homes, where I've got a perfect example where the guy was literally bragging. He had the best air conditioning unit known to man. They told him he needed a 2-ton unit. He told him, you know what? How much is it for a 3-ton unit? And they said, well, we don't recommend it. How much is it? It was only an extra $500. Well, that's a no-brainer. I'm going to have better air conditioning. No, his air conditioning ran for about 5 minutes per hour instead of 15 to 20 minutes per hour, which means it had no chance to dehumidify his home. So then he had to put in dehumidifiers. And what did dehumidifiers put off? Heat. So then his air conditioning had to cut on to offset the dehumidifiers that were only there because the air conditioning unit was wrongly sized for the house. So it can grow anywhere and in just about any temperature. What you can do is you can control your humidity and any water intrusions. If you get a leak, if you get a pipe bust, if you get anything like that, dry it up as fast as possible. Dehumidifiers, fans, if it's wet for 24 to 48 hours, good rule of thumb is start looking for mold, because that's about all it takes. We've seen explosive growth in 24 hours of wetness. It does not take much. So drying it out as quickly as you possibly can. If you already have a dehumidifier, that's fantastic. Then you put a fan blowing on the water, you're putting it into the air, maybe even putting a space heater, not in the water, obviously, you want to be safe. But there's oil radiator style heaters maybe in front of the fan, so it's warming the room up, helping it to evaporate, helping to keep the room warm so the dehumidifier can do its job better. So we control the moisture. If you think that you have mold, what should your next step be? Very first thing that I recommend is a professional inspection. And when I say professional inspection, I don't mean certified. Everyone is certified. Everyone is, whether their own company certifies them or whether they pay to play. There's a lot of organizations out there that you can literally say, I want to be certified by you, and they say, oh, okay, pass this 50-question quiz and pay us $500 a year and we'll give you a certification stamp. Well, if we can't even get doctors to agree on what the problem with mold is and what the proper levels of mold is, how is this third-party organization gonna know anything about what you're specifically dealing with? And so a lot of times you'll call an inspector and they'll say, oh, well, I'd love to come out. Yep, I'm certified with, InterNACHI, ACAC, with the International Inspectors Guild. I've got Testall, and they'll just go through this list of certifications. And my next question is, how many homes have you inspected? Because if the answer is 20, I don't want your certifications. I want your certifications and I want your experience, which is why, for example, our company, all of our inspectors go on at least 20 or 30 inspections with somebody who's done it hundreds of times before they ever even go into a home and are in charge of the inspection. And then they're monitored for the next 20 or 30 inspections with somebody like myself watching them do the inspections to make sure they're not missing anything. And the other reason that you want somebody with experience is because inspectors will miss things. It's impossible to see everything. Last I checked, Superman doesn't have his own mold remediation inspection company, so we can't see through the walls, can't see through your floors, we can't see underneath your tile. There are things that we cannot see, which is why they have testing. But there is no perfect test either. So the good thing about somebody with experience is they've learned from mistakes. They've searched a home, not found anything, ran air quality testing, for example, found elevated levels. They've gone back to the house and they've torn it to shreds till they can find where the problem was. And guess what? That's one of the places that they look the next time. The first 10 times they do an inspection, with the person shadowing them, they miss a lot. And then they start learning from that. And then they start walking into a home and quickly finding the problem, quickly finding the things. But they're not going to always find it. So no, I do not want to do software updates. Remind me later. So some of the other ways that you can do testing, and keep in mind there is no perfect testing. There's testing I dislike, there's testing I love, but none of it's perfect, and all of it is useful in some way. It's just important to know when, where, and why to do certain kinds of testing. So this person looks like they're taking a fingerprint sample, and that is something that we use. That's called a tape lift or a surface sample. And I see that, I think it's mold. Let me stick this on it, send it to the laboratory, and the laboratory is going to tell me two things. One is what I'm looking at, mold, and if it is, what kind, or at least what genus is it, because under a microscope you can still only tell so much. And two, are there stems? Is the hyphal stem there? So if you walk into a yard and you see a dandelion growing up, you see the stem, you see the seeds on top, it's growing, right? We can conclude it's probably growing. But if you walk into a yard and you see all the little white seeds from the dandelion, that doesn't mean it's growing. So if I do a surface test here, there's a good chance I'm going to find mold. And the reason is what? Because mold's everywhere. But if I don't find the hyphal stems, then maybe it's not actually growing there. Now, mold, just like dandelions, if I run a lawnmower over it, I might chop an entire stem and dandelion and throw it 30 feet away, and you might pick it up and say, oh my gosh, look, I have growing dandelions right here, but it's been long dead, or it doesn't even exist where you just picked it up. Same thing happens with the hyphal stems. They actually break off very easily. You can brush by them and you can break them off. Your vacuum can break them off. Airflow can break them off. Your fan turning on can break them off. So if I observe what I believe to be mold, then I do a surface test and I find mold and a hyphal stem, then I'll conclude this appears to be growing mold. But if I just stuck it randomly right here where it doesn't appear to be any mold growth and I find a hyphal stem, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's growing there. So every single one of these tests, the purpose is to gather as much information as you possibly can and then make an educated decision. There is no perfect test, and all tests can be wrong. So you try to gather as much information as you possibly can, and then you try to make educated decisions from there. This is an air quality test unit. I've got one of those over here I can show people. This is what we run our entire business on, is these two type of tests for the most part. And the reason that I like the air quality test, and you'll hear people who love it and who hate it. Again, it's not a perfect system. The reason I like it is because if you call 10 air quality testing companies, and all 10 of them walk through your door, and all 10 of them set up, and all 10 of them do the test, you're going to find almost identical results. There is no other mold test that can give you that congruent of testing from one person to the next, from this level of training to this level of training. My 5-year-old knows how to run this machine. He's known how to run it for 2 years. When he was 3, he was already adjusting the rotometer to adjust the airflow. He already knew to adjust it to the right amount of time. He just didn't actually know how long 5 minutes was. That was the only part he was lacking. He could have run an air quality test pretty successfully, and it would have rivaled anyone else's air quality test. Problems with the air quality test is, 1, somebody does it improperly. 2, if they don't ask you the proper questions. 1, did you vacuum today? Because if you did, your air quality is going to be worse than it was yesterday. So maybe I do a test and I tell you that your air quality is terrible, but really you just ran a shark vacuum that day and it threw it all up into the air. And I don't care what vacuum says they're picking up mold, it's not. A Dyson tells you it picks up mold. Probably shouldn't use brand names since I'm being recorded. We'll bleep that out, right? They tell you that it's going to pick up mold spores. But if you read the fine print, that's when the filter is 99.99% clogged, it starts picking up mold spores. Same with your air filters that you put in your wall. If you read the fine print, at 99.97%, it'll start catching 5-micron mold spores, which is a pretty big mold spore. So that stuff's not typically going to pick it up. Our vacuums that we use are ridiculously expensive and won't pick up dog hair. So tell me that Dyson is able to sell something for half the cost as our mold vacuums, and it's able to pick up the dog hair, it's able to pick up the sticks, the pennies, the coins, and it's also going to be able to pick up the mold spores. Our vacuums are made to pull as much air as possible because we're trying to break loose any of the mold spores and pull those up. And the stuff that's woven into the carpet, like your dog hair, it's going to stay there. There's no spinning brushes or any of that stuff. No bells or whistles on the mold vacuums. So if they vacuumed that day, it's going to affect the air quality test. If they've had their windows open for the last 5 days and they closed them the day you got there and you didn't ask, then it's going to affect the outdoor tests. A building like this is a commercial building. It's required by law to bring in a certain percentage of outdoor air, and most commercial buildings are going to replace all indoor air about 3 times a day. So an indoor air quality test might not be the best option inside of a commercial building. I've been in buildings where, depending on the temperature and humidity outside, it will bring in 100% outdoor air all day long and all night. So you might run a test and it's literally just the same exact test as your outdoor air and you're looking at growing mold. So again, there are flaws with it. And anything that requires mold to be airborne, some people call them heavy molds, which is kind of a misnomer. Wet molds, molds that require constant heavy moisture are wet. Imagine flour on your countertop. You brush your hand across it, it'll go floating everywhere. Now spray it with a little bit of water and brush your hand across it, it'll stick. It's not going anywhere. Mold's the same way, only 1/50th the size of one speck of flour. So if you can imagine it, when it's wet and it's damp, it's not going anywhere. It's not going to be in your air quality test. It's not going to be in your carpet. It's not going to be on your surface test unless you find it and you test it directly. So there are flaws to all the tests. This one here is called an ERMI test. And many of you might have heard of that. I see that a lot of times in message boards and forums. I personally, I'm going to step outside of the professional realm for a minute, I personally despise the ERMI test because it is not scientifically replicatable. If you had 10 people come into your house and run the same ERMI test, you would get 10 very different results. If one of them ran them in the carpet next to your kitchen, maybe you find some smut mold, because the person likes to eat a lot of corn. So when they're shucking the corn, some smut mold's coming over here and it's landing on the carpet. So they ran a test here and they say, oh my gosh, your house is completely full of smut mold. And then the next time they run one in the bedroom, well, there's no moisture source in the bedroom and it's heavily air conditioned, so it's got a pretty low humidity, so maybe they don't find much of anything. And then they do it outside of your laundry room where it's pretty humid and warm, and so they find a completely different type of mold. And so when somebody does 3 different ERMI tests in the same house, they end up with 3 very different results. Why the ERMI test was ever invented was going back to the asthma thing. They wanted to find, was there a historical correlation between people in lower income homes in one specific city that had asthma? Did they have historical high levels of mold? So they sent in scientists that had specific protocols. They marked off a meter. And I'm generalizing this because I don't remember the test exactly. They mark off a meter with tape. They tape down plastic around all that so they don't get anything except that meter. And they bring in these ridiculously powerful vacuums. And they vacuumed like this, and they had to make sure it was 15 times. And then they vacuumed like this, and they had to make sure it was 15 times. And they went back to this way and made sure it was the exact same count. They would skip this house because the carpet was too tall. They would skip this house because the carpet was too small. They would skip this house because the only carpet sample that worked was too close to the kitchen, and all the rest of the test samples were somewhere else in the house. So they did about 1,000 tests in low-income homes in one city to try to prove or disprove whether there was a historical relation to there being elevated levels of mold inside of your carpet to people developing asthma. And then the ERMI test proved that, and the ERMI test was forgotten. It was forgotten and it wasn't used anymore. And then people applied to the EPA, which is why they say using EPA ERMI technology. They applied to the EPA for the ability to do the testing themselves. And then they send people at-home test units. And they tell you, you can do this extremely advanced scientific test on your own. And you've got pile carpet that's this tall, that's been in there for 60 years. And then they send it to me, and I've got carpet that's this tall, it's been in there for a year. And then they want to compare those 2 results. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to. Now, there are times when the ERMI test is appropriate, but a really good way to sum it up without going too much into detail is a lot of people wear smartwatches now, and they tell you your heart rate. Let's say that they had a smartwatch that told you your temperature. It just monitored your temperature all the time. And you went to the doctor because you have a fever of 102. And the doctor says, listen, you've got all the signs and symptoms of the flu and you've got a fever. Well, wait a minute, doctor, wait a minute, hold on. I can print off a chart of the last 35 years of my temperature. You want to look at that? No, he's not going to want to look at that. You know, he doesn't care that you had a temperature of 101 32 years ago. That's why as a mold remediation company, we don't care that there was a mold problem 35 years ago. Mold spores die in about 5 years. They stop producing toxins shortly after that. So let's say that the carpet's been down for 40 years and 39 and a half years ago, there was a terrible mold problem with the worst of the worst, Stachybotrys, the black mold, and it got all over the house. They fixed the mold problem, and now 40 years later, I come in with the most powerful vacuum I can buy and I vacuum it up doing an ERMI test, I'm gonna find some of those spores. Does that mean you're being exposed to it? Does that mean you're being exposed to those toxins? No, not even slightly. So there have been times I've recommended the test, but that's when it makes sense to have that test done. The carpet's a year old, the company you work for did remediation, they claimed there was no mold. Now maybe we can do an ERMI test because we know that it's within the last year, because now we're aging the carpet. The carpet's only a year old, so whatever's in it has been in this building in the last year. So the problem with the ERMI test is that individuals do it and they're not given a whole lot of guidance. So a lot of times it's done when it shouldn't be done, and then it's compared to results that don't necessarily make sense to compare it to. These two type of tests I'm just going to throw out there are garbage. And that is my professional opinion. That is not just me speaking. These things cost like $9. You get them from Lowe's, you set it out, and they hope that whatever lands on it, and it starts to grow, and then they expect you to look at pictures and identify mold based on pictures. Well, you can't identify mold by sight. You can try to, but there's a lot of molds that look very similar. That's why it's PennAsp, Penicillium aspergillus. There's a lot of different kinds of penicillium, and there's a lot of different kinds of aspergillus, and then there's even other types of mold that are thrown into that category because even under a microscope, they look almost identical. So we let them bloom and we let them grow, and then we try to identify them, and when we can't, we send them off to a laboratory for $40 a piece for them to tell us, yes, that is this type of mold. But how much is there in my house? Because there's mold everywhere. So yeah, great, you found mold. I could have told you that, it's everywhere. Well, it's the bad kind of mold, okay, but how much is there in my home? Oh, there was a ton growing on there, okay, but did 5 spores happen to land on it? And those were the only 5 spores in the entire room? It's possible. So not a very good test, doesn't really stand up to scientific scrutiny. This here, I've never seen anyone around here do, but it's good that the more people who know about this, so that nobody around here starts doing it. This is a protein test. It's a luminometer, and it's used in pharmaceutical labs, hospitals, restaurants, and they can go into a cooking counter and they can wipe off a certain section, they know the math, they wipe off 2 feet of it, they put it in there, it counts the DNA, counts the protein, and it gives you a rating. This is how clean or dirty that environment was. Well, guess what? That can't tell the difference between peanut butter and mold. And for a while, there were a lot of mold remediation companies that would come in with one of those, and they'd go to the dirtiest part of your house, which is probably the top of your door frame, because let's be honest, when was the last time we vacuumed that? And they would wipe it across the entire top of the door frame, and they'd put it in there and they'd say, oh my gosh, it's 16,000. I don't know the real numbers, I'm making it up. It's 16,000, a restaurant can't even have 8. You've got a terrible mold problem. And then they do remediation, and guess where they vacuum? The top of the door frame. And they come back and they say, hey, let's redo the same test so we know it's scientifically accurate. And they wipe it across the same thing, and look at that, 0. Of course they did, because they knew they were gonna test in the exact same place. You'll see the same thing done with surface tests, when people try to use surface tests as a way to prove remediation was successful. They will literally draw a square with tape on your wall, they'll swab it, they'll send it off to the laboratory, they'll tell you this is the type of mold that we found, we'll do the remediation, don't touch that. They'll come back, they'll swab the exact same spot. How hard was that? They cleaned it. and then they swabbed the exact same spot. They knew where it was. If you want to make that test a little bit more scientifically accurate, they would walk in and they'd say, tell me where to test, and I'll test anywhere the exact same way. And if it's been eliminated everywhere, then theoretically that test would work. Still not a very good process for deciding whether remediation was successful or not. So thankfully I've not heard of anyone around doing that, but if y'all ever see anyone say, oh, I can give you an instant mold reading, I can give you an instant count. Well, unless they're bringing in a, micron, an electron microscope, they're driving around with a $400,000 microscope in the back of their van, and they're looking at the mold spores underneath that so that they can try to get down past the genus because they want to tell you exactly what type of mold it is. It's not going to happen. It can't happen. Moving on, fresh air. Houses built after the 70s energy crisis are much more likely to have mold. So moving into a new home does not mean moving away from mold. Because during the energy crisis, what happened? Everyone's energy bills went up. So what did they do? They started looking for building practices that would drop the energy bills back down. They started wrapping houses in plastic. They started putting insulation in the walls that didn't exist before, right? The plaster became more expensive because the wood slats behind it were more expensive. So what did they do? They started making they started making drywall board, and it became more readily available. What's drywall board? 2 pieces of paper with a bunch of junk piled in between. But what does mold love to grow on? Paper. So we're literally coating our houses with paper so that we're inviting mold to grow on it. Now, paint does help slow that growth. All paints help slow that growth, but they definitely don't stop it. Mold will just root right through the paint. So fresh air is not a bad thing. Air from outside to in is not a bad thing. As the EPA says, 4 to 5 times more polluted inside your home than outside of your home. So bringing in outdoor air is good. Let's say that we went to Old Southwest and we found a house that was built 100 years ago, and you dumped 55-gallon drum of water in their basement, and then you did the same thing to a house that was built last year, completely LEED certified, 6-inch walls instead of 2.5-inch walls, insulated as much as it possibly can. It's the most sealed up, best building ever. It's the most environmentally energy friendly building ever. And you dump that same 55-gallon drum, the old house is going to dry out and the humidity is going to go back down to normal, probably before the other house even dries out. And then it's got the humidity trapped. It's got nowhere to go. It's trapped. It's stuck. Now, I'm not saying stop building houses that are energy efficient. That'd kind of be the opposite of green home solutions, right? But it does mean that if you live in a home that is sealed up like a Ziploc bag, you got to treat it like a Ziploc bag. You either introduce outdoor air. You could, fans in the windows. They used to put whole house fans in. They're my favorite thing in the world is whole house fans, and you don't see those in constructions anymore. Or doing something to treat and manage your indoor air, humidity, your air quality. There's many different options out there.
Do you know what is that?
I do actually. This one here is Stachybotrys right there. And so Stachybotrys is heavy mold, it's wet mold. So how does it move around? It moves around the same way that thorn bush seeds move around. A deer walks through, it gets stuck to the deer, they take it to the next field. An ant, a caterpillar, a spider helps to move Stachybotrys around. Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, depending on how you say it. There's a whole slew of them that grow in heavy water areas, and they're typically transferred by animals. And that's why they grow in that patchiness that you'll see with Stachybotrys. But no inspector can go in and say, oh yeah, I know what that is, that's Stachybotrys. I only know that's Stachybotrys because we tested it. I assumed it was, it looked like it. Heck, there were so many different kinds of mold growing there. I mean, I could have just thrown out 16 names and probably been right half the time. You can see that there's greenish here, there's white here, there's yellow over here, there's black over here. I don't know what color you would classify that as. You got some green right here. So, there's a lot of different kinds of mold growing in there because once you have an environment that's wonderful for mold, mold's gonna just start growing and all different kinds are gonna grow. This one here is another humidity-based mold. This was just growing on the ceiling of a house where it was forced air heat and they upgraded it to air conditioning. That's wonderful. We put in an HVAC unit, but they didn't insulate the ductwork. So now they started sending 100% humidity, ice cold air through it, and all around it in that wall cavity, it just starts dripping. And so inside that wall cavity, it gets soaking wet, and you can walk into some of these houses where they've converted from forced air to air conditioning, and we walk into the home and we identified it immediately. We walk in and we're like, well, I can see the lines from the duct vents. There's your trunk line. We can see it all from underneath, so if I rip out the drywall, I'm gonna see that it's uninsulated. So do as I might, sterilize it as much as I want. If you don't insulate that ductwork, it's just gonna keep happening because you're gonna have 18-degree colder or 25-degree colder, depending on how efficient your system is, air turning that metal cold, yet the rest of the house is humid, so it's gonna start dripping. Mr. Peanut, is dead mold still bad? This is another hotly debated topic, and if anyone ever tells you dead mold is not bad, here's a perfect example for you. Have you ever heard of somebody finding out that they had a peanut allergy because they pulled up a peanut bush and started chewing on the root system? No, that was alive peanuts, right? No, they go to a gas station that's a rundown gas station. They buy a pack of peanut butter crackers that have probably been sitting there since Nam, and they start eating it and they go into respiratory arrest or they have some sort of an allergenic reaction to it. It doesn't matter how long that peanut butter's been dead, doesn't matter how long and how much it's been processed. If the protein structure is still there, it's still bad for you. Now there comes a point when it stops producing toxins, and that's when it gets better for you. But it's still not good to breathe it in, still not good to be around. So this environment here, we could sterilize that to where nothing's growing whatsoever, but if the spores are still floating around, if you found a way to get concrobium or bleach or acid or any of those other products that don't kill the root system, let's say you found a way to actually kill the root system, but you left it there, well, then you're still going to be breathing it in, and you still might have adverse effects to it. Now, it might stop producing toxins, and it might stop growing, but you still don't want to be around it. You still don't want to be breathing all of that in. So, in my opinion, yes, dead mold is still bad. And a little plug for Green Home Solutions, we have something that destroys mold all the way down to the root system, all the way down to the cellular structure, and it splits the nucleus of the cell, which is the protein structure, and breaks it down into simple amino acids. So we could theoretically spray that, and it would turn really grayish and tan and kind of start to dissipate, and you could test it for volatile organic compounds, for mycotoxins, endotoxins, and spores, and you wouldn't find any of them. So it's pretty amazing. But when you go to the big box store and you buy the $2.50 bottle of stuff, heck, our stuff costs nearly $1,000 a gallon, our cost. If I could go to Lowe's and buy the $2 a gallon stuff, I would if it would work, but it just doesn't. Now this is unsavable. Why would you want to save it? Just rip it out, throw it away. No reason to save it. Finding mold can save you money. This is an example of why air quality testing is good. I don't know how long I've been talking. Hopefully it's not too long. This is an example of why air quality testing is good. We went into a home that had a musty odor, and we searched and we searched and we searched and we couldn't find any mold. We crawled through the crawl space. That's where this is. Crawled through this nasty crawl space. I mean, all crawl spaces are nasty. Couldn't find any mold. But that one room, it just had this musty odor. We just couldn't figure out what it was. So they paid to have air quality testing done. And we ran about 7 tests in the house and 1 test outside. It was a huge house. And the room that smelled musty, we found Chaetomium, which is a waterborne mold. And we shouldn't really find it airborne. So if we found it airborne, it means it's been growing for a very long time. It's started to outgrow the wet area, and now it becomes dry, and it's able to get out into the air. So we found it in the air. We also found it in the air in a crawl space. All crawl spaces have terrible air, all of them. So when you do an air quality test in a crawl space, it comes back from the laboratory and they say, hey, this is terrible, it needs remediation. Not necessarily. All crawl spaces have pretty bad air, so you have to kind of judge that on a sliding scale. But we found the same mold in the crawl space. And we had seen some mold on the joists in the crawl space, but not enough and nothing that would have indicated a waterborne mold. So we went back out to the house and we started ripping insulation down underneath the room that was the musty odor. And they didn't want to rip down the insulation because it was all tacked up and it was all perfectly done and it looked beautiful, and we went in there and we ripped it all out. But what did we find? We found this. The underside of the toilet was dripping ever so slowly, getting trapped in between the wood and the tile. So until it had grown out across all of the tile, until the water had made its way past all the tile and started growing up the walls, they would have never found this unless they went into the crawl space and pulled away the insulation. So this is a perfect example of why I love air quality testing, because it is kind of our X-ray vision. It kind of tells us what we're not able to see. Mold is microscopic. Back to baby powder instead of flour. I don't know the size of flour. Baby powder is about 40 to 50 microns in size per speck. Mold can be a half of a micron. So literally 1/100th the size of a speck of baby powder. It can travel through wood grain. It can travel in between your floorboards, in between your drywall. It can come up through your ceiling or up through your wall and come in through your electrical outlets. It can make its way through all those paths just based on pressure. It gets cold up here, hot down here, the air is going to exchange, and it's going to carry the mold with it. So that's why we were able to find this up there, even though it was sealed by the tile, because the crawl space was now full of it, and it was floating its way up into the house. And we would have never found that had we not done air quality tests, or went in there and ripped down all of their insulation with no real prior reason or cause to do it, other than there's a slight musty odor, which could have been mold years ago that died off. And the musty odor remained, because sometimes it does. So sometimes it can be helpful. Sometimes it can save you money. We recommend to anyone buying a home, get a mold inspection, just because you don't want to buy it, have that problem, and not find out about it until your toilet starts to sink into your crawl space. Because let's be honest, this wood would have eventually started caving. I mean, it was getting pretty bad. This is another example of Stachybotrys. That is the black mold. It's the one that everyone's worried about, but there's 100,000 different types of mold, and they're discovering new ones every single year. Literally, they're classifying new ones every single month, and that's not the only one to produce toxins. There are ones that are just as bad that are just not as well known. But that is the black mold, and here's an example of what it looks like after we treated it. Is after an amount of time, it eventually starts to break down and stop looking like mold. That was a heavy, wet environment. They had water coming in from their foundation. Pretty bad situation. Here's the kind of lovely things that we find in ductwork. Clearly some kid had a lot of fun in this bathroom, throwing everything they could find down in this ductwork. In fact, when I dug all that out, that stick of secret deodorant that was secretly hiding in there, had expired 10 years before. And I don't know how long deodorant's good for, but it's got to be good for at least a year or two. So that was at least 11 or 12 years old that it's been in there. And funny enough, I went in there to do the ductwork cleaning, and they said, oh, don't worry about the one in the bathroom. That vent doesn't work. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't work? And they said, that vent doesn't work. I said, a vent's just a hole. how does a hole not work? I mean, it should work. And they're like, I don't know. We've been here for 6 years. When we bought it, they told us that vent has never worked. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it was just never hooked up. I've seen that before. Here's a vent and it was never actually hooked up. But then I looked at it and it was hooked up. Went down in the basement. I could find the line going to it. And I tried to send my vacuum down in and it got stuck. So I reached my hand in there and I touched this hairbrush that women like to use. That's the circly thing with all the little spindles on it, and put my hand right on that and jerked it out so fast I about broke my arm. And then after digging out pencil sharpeners, combs, plastic knives, razors, hairbrushes, and all that stuff, we were finally able to get that ductwork clean and tell her that her vent was fixed. It works again. That's an example of clean ductwork. I don't know why I have that and not an example of dirty ductwork. This is what ductwork typically looks like. It's coated in a mild level of dust. And dust is a perfect place for mold to start growing, which is why it does start growing, because that's what ductwork typically looks like. You can see the clean side and the dirty side. Clean side, much less likely to grow bacteria, mold, yeasts, funguses, stuff like that. More examples of Stachybotrys. Now this actually is glue. They had glued down their quarter round or their trim board. You can see where the trim board ended. But this is Stachybotrys in a wet basement. The black mold. This family, 3 members of the family were going to 3 different doctors, and all 3 of them told them that they had rare genetic disorders. So 3 family members that all 3 had rare genetic disorders that were all different from each other, that there was no familial history of that rare genetic disorder. And the parents called me one day and they just said, we got a lot of mold growing in our basement. Went out there, they told us about all that. We treated this. About a month later, they came off all their medicine. So that was really messing with that family. This is an example of humidity-based mold. This is an empty house. The air conditioning was turned off, and you can see mold is just growing on all the wall. All of the walls looked like that. Every square inch of every single wall looked like that. And the person selling the house was like, that's just a little mold problem. Just spray some bleach on it. Well, bleach doesn't kill mold. It just doesn't. It doesn't work for that. It won't absorb. It's ionic. And it destroys itself in the process of destroying the mold. So bleach will not kill mold. It's not something that a remediator can use. And if we can't use it, that kind of tells you it doesn't work, right? In fact, bleach had to take off of their labels their recipe for mixing bleach and water. Bleach, which is already 96% water, used to tell you to mix 1 part bleach to 4 parts water. So instead of 96%, it was about 1% bleach, and then they tell you to spread it all over that. And we actually go into homes where we can see that they cleaned it with bleach. And we can walk in and we say, tried to clean it with bleach, didn't you? I'm like, yeah, how'd you know? And it's because they started here, and they scrubbed up and down, and then they scrubbed around, and then they got to this side, and they scrubbed up and down, and guess what the mold grew? In that exact same pattern. And you look at it and you're like, wow, why does it look like you took a sponge covered in black paint and you painted the wall with it? And that's because they cleaned it and it was beautiful, and then 2 weeks later it was twice as bad as it was before. And so they cleaned it again, and 3 weeks later it was even worse than it was before. That's it. That was a lot.
Man, that